get started, I just need to go over a couple of housekeeping items. So right now, everyone's on mute just to avoid any background noises, but we of course want to encourage active participation. So if you have a question, just type it into that question box that you see at the right-hand side of your webinar screen. We'll monitor those questions as they come in, and Travis will try to answer as many of those as possible at the end of the webinar. We will also be live tweeting throughout the webinar, so feel free to join in the conversation online by following here at Analytics 8, and he's also our Qlik practice lead. Travis has over 15 years of experience helping clients with data visualization, data management, data modeling, data integration, and training, and he also does a bunch of different Qlik presentations. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Travis.
Thank you, Tracy, and thank you everybody for joining in today. I know with the current situation, your time is valuable, so I appreciate everybody taking the time to listen to our presentation here today. So today we're really going to talk about a couple of key items when it comes to migrating to the Qlik Sense environment. So the first thing we're going to really start to discuss is why should you migrate, or why are people migrating, right? Then we'll talk about a project approach to migration, the common considerations that you may need to take into account when you're doing that migration, and then we'll have some time for some questions. So to begin, why are people migrating to Qlik Sense, or why should your organization migrate to Qlik Sense? And one of the biggest reasons why people are migrating is because Qlik is really becoming a more robust platform when it comes to their offering. So initially, many of us who have worked in the Qlik world for years, right? Qlik really lived in the space of the data visualization, right? So you had Qlikview, then came Qlik Sense, but in the last couple of years, they're really starting to expand the type of offerings and services they have. Now, one of those areas is in the data ingestion or data integration area, and this is their new product, Tunity, as well as QDC. We're not going to go into a lot of detail around those, but suffice it to say, those are really useful tools to help people migrate data from their source system into either data warehouses, data lakes, and then providing platforms for people to be able to access that data in a very usable, friendly manner that also incorporates data governance and security. But the big area that they're making some upgrades in is the insights area. And the insights area is really the big portion that provides that rationale of why we would want to move to the Qlik Sense environment. So with Qlik Sense, they are starting to make certain acquisitions, such as Rocks AI. They're also starting to do some internal development, such as their Insight Bot. These are different developments that are available only within the Qlik Sense platform, but they expand on the traditional data visualization platform. So no longer is it simply just a Qlikview or Qlik Sense application that a user goes into. Their insights area are really allowing people to interact with the data that lives within their applications in a completely different way, right? With the Insight Bot, it allows you to go into Slack, Microsoft Teams, whatever sort of messaging program you use, and simply ask questions of your data. So you can type in, tell me what is the spend for the last quarter, or what is the spend in this region over the last 12 months. It really gives people a larger means of interacting with the data in the system. Additionally, Rocks AI allows you to have different thresholds set up within your data that will then kick off different messages or alerts to your user base. So for example, with Rocks AI and the Ping software, you can indicate that if your spend, let's say, goes down by 5%, it'll automatically shoot out an email with some of the visualizations or some of the data within your system, and it'll send it out to, let's say, your VP of sales or your head of sales, right? It allows you to not force people to proactively go into an application, but it allows the system to be proactive in moving that data to you. And all of these insights that are being developed, they're being developed on the Qlik Sense platform. So that's one of the big reasons, we see a lot of people moving to the Qlik Sense environment is all of these additional benefits in the insight and the additional ways that you can get data out to your user group. Now, another area that stopped people from migrating before was the limitations of the Qlik Sense product itself. So if anybody has worked with Qlik over the last 3 or 4 years, when Qlik Sense came out, there were definitely some limitations in terms of the types of charts, the different graphs, the different properties, the different adjustments that could be made on those charts and graphs. There really were some legitimate limitations on that product that prevented people from moving over. But Qlik has had a pretty steady release cycle. It's multiple times a year that they're releasing new versions of the application, and they've really caught up with Qlikview and in many ways surpassed the capabilities of Qlikview. So if there were any sort of issues around migrating to this Qlik Sense environment, if you had Qlikview previously because it wasn't able to replicate the type of visuals that you used, those concerns really are no longer the case with the updates that they've made. Additionally, with Qlik Branch and the extensibility, right, the limitations are able to be addressed even if it hasn't been addressed within the new releases of Qlik. Because of the way that Qlik Sense is structured and how extensible it is, it allows you to go ahead and build your own charts, graphs, functionality through its extensibility. So those are really some of the reasons why people would migrate and sort of addressing some of the concerns people have of why they would stay with the Qlikview product. So when you've made that decision to go ahead and migrate to the Qlik Sense environment, you really need to have a structured project approach to the migration. And the best approach that we've seen utilized and we've implemented with our clients is really 5 simple steps. And the first step is mapping the future state. Then we want to review the existing environment, right? So we want to know where we're going. We want to know where we are. We want to be able to document that data flow because we need to be able to see where the data is coming from the source. So let's say a data warehouse or a data lake. Then how is that data getting updated in our applications? And how often that information is being updated. My apologies, I have a little bit of a cough. So once we're able to document that data flow, we need to engage in a proof of concept. So the best laid plans, we might not be able to execute on them. And having a proof of concept is really useful in being able to determine where are those issues in our project and in our workflow. And then finally, we need to do the development, right? So we need to build the applications. We need to move all of the script over to that new environment. So now we're going to talk about some common considerations that we have in regards to this project approach. So the first part of our project is mapping out the future state. As I said, we need to know where we're going in order to understand how to get there. At any time you're doing a migration, there's typically a reason or an underlying need that is the impetus for you to migrate to that new environment. So that's the key thing that needs to be understood when we're mapping out that future state. It's understanding why are we doing the migration? What are the benefits that we're trying to achieve? What are the downfalls that we're trying to avoid? And so when mapping out that future state, we want to take a look at what are the pain points of that existing system, right? What are we not able to do with the environment that we have? Additionally, we want to make sure we're looking at who are our users? How are they interacting with the data? Do we have a bunch of sales members who are interacting with it on the tablet, mobile? Do we have people sitting in their offices utilizing the application on their desktop? What is the way that people are interacting with this data so that we can understand what are the various tools that we need to implement in this new solution? Additionally, we want to make sure that we're understanding, is the data operational or is it executive, right? And the big difference here is, does the data help us perform a specific task? Does it help us do our job? Or is it executive reporting that really just looks at trying to get an understanding of how well we're doing our job? And that's a huge difference between how we develop our applications, because one's really looking behind, right? One's really looking at the goals of our organization, our trends, our targets, where we want to be. And the other is really providing our user base with the type of data and type of information they need to do their business on a day-to-day basis, right? That's going to change how you implement that type of BI tool, such as Qlik Sense, right? So if it's operational, oftentimes you're going to want to take advantage of the mobile capabilities, right? You're going to want to be able to take advantage of the fact that it can provide the information out to the user groups. So how up to date does that data need to be, right? And when does it need to be available to the users? This is a huge consideration when you're mapping out that future state, because it can change how you create your data warehouse, how you create that data flow from your source system to the warehouse to your applications. Is this something that needs to be up to date as of the last minute, the last minute or the last hour? Is it okay if it's up to date as of, today or yesterday? Is this weekly reporting, monthly reporting? You need to have that understanding of how often the data needs to be updated in the system. Additionally, you need to understand whether or not the data needs to be shown as a point in time versus an up-to-date information. Now, what do I mean by this? Point in time data is really a snapshot of the data at an individual point in time. So if you have monthly reporting, quarterly reporting, do you want to see the data reported as of the last day of the month? And does that data change, right? So if new data is added into the source system, new lines or adjustments are being made, do you want to save it so that it's only showing what was reported last month, or do you want that information to be updated? This is critically important when you're designing your visualizations as well as your data warehouse, because it goes to the fact of whether or not you're able to go back in time and be able to show what the data was at a given point in time. And that's where you implement snapshots, right? So you take a snapshot of your data as of, let's say, the last day of a given month, and you save that information somewhere, right? Typically, that's going to be in your data warehouse, or it could be in your QVD layer, right? You can always maintain that this was our data as of the end of every given month. But those are really critical things to have known as you're mapping out what that future state needs to be, okay? Then you're going to want to take a look at the existing environment. So when you know where you need to go, what type of data you need to have, how often it needs to be updated, you need to take a review of your existing environment, right? So oftentimes when we're doing migration projects, we see that there is a lack of trust in the data initially. And that's part of the reason why people are migrating to the new environment, because the business isn't happy with the type of data and information that they're receiving. So part of the solution is migrating to this new environment. But you really need to make sure you're reviewing that existing environment, because oftentimes it's an issue with the data, right? And it doesn't matter if you have a new front end, if you have a new means of getting people the information. If the underlying data is wrong or people don't trust it, then it doesn't matter how you present it to them. So that's why any type of existing environment that you have, you need to take a review to start taking a look at it. And when you're taking a look at this existing environment, you need to make sure you understand the source systems, okay? So this is where the data is being entered that's flowing into your data warehouse or your data lake. Oftentimes, the BI developers, we may not have access to that source system, right? We just get the data after it's placed in the data warehouse. We're actually not seeing how a user goes and enters that information in, whether that's in Salesforce, whether that's in PeopleSoft, whether that's in any custom front end. Oftentimes, you just don't have that visibility. And that's where you need to make sure that you're assigning one individual to be responsible for that source system and understanding how does that source system work? How does it interact with the different data elements? So a big thing that we've seen is post-dating of data, right? A business intelligence developer may assume that data can't be post-dated. So if the data says that a project was completed on a certain date, a developer may assume that that date can never be changed. But that may or may not be the case. Certain source systems, depending on what it is, could allow somebody at a later date and time to go back and add a certain date element. You need to understand that of how does any of the dates in the system or any of the values in the system, are they something that is automatically created by the system, or is that something that people can manually enter, right? And this goes to some of the other contradictions that you can possibly find within your data sets. I was working with an organization where we were pulling over project-based data, and we would always have a start date, an in-process date, a completed date, or a canceled date. In addition to those different dates, they also had a status. So a project could be in progress, it could be completed, it could be canceled, it could be started. However, the date field was not tied to that status. So what that means is that somebody could have a canceled date of yesterday. However, the status was completed. So those two fields didn't necessarily talk to each other, and that could cause some contradictions in your data. And it could be the source of some of the lack of trust within the data analytics. Because if you're going by, let's say, the canceled date as our measure for how many cancellations we've had versus going off of the status, right, you could get two completely different answers to that question. So it's pivotally important that you have one person who's responsible for understanding how that source system works, how it interacts with the user, and how that feeds your source system. Additionally, it's important to understand, right, the facts and dimensions and what is the source of truth. So we see this all the time where we may have transactional level data that has a supplier name, a supplier part number, a supplier number itself, and we may also have a table that is our master supplier table that has all of the suppliers across our organization with their IDs. We may have a difference between those two, right? On our transaction level data, the name may be, let's say, Google, where the name in our master dimension table is actually Alphabet, right? Because oftentimes companies could have two different names. So what's the version of truth? Where are we going to go for that type of information? That's important to understand within any data model, how we're going to determine when there's contradictory information, right? Additionally, it's helpful to understand how nulls will be handled, right? So we may have that same situation where we have a list of suppliers and the transactions, as well as a master supplier table. So what if there's no supplier name in the transaction level? Or there's no supplier name in our master, but it is available in our transaction level, right? How do we handle that? How do we work through that? That's extremely important because, again, when people get data that is inaccurate or they can't trust it, it doesn't matter how you're presenting it to them. Doesn't matter what charts, what graphs, it doesn't matter what functionality you have. If the underlying information is inaccurate, it's going to be a problem. Okay. Then we need to understand and document the data flow. And the biggest issue here is making sure that there are clear roles and responsibilities when we're documenting the data flow. I have worked on multiple projects where there is more than one developer associated with that project. And most business intelligence projects, especially when you're talking about a migration, are going to include multiple people. And the most important thing is making sure that everybody understands who's responsible for which piece during that data flow. I can't tell you how many times I've been involved with projects where a clear delineation of the responsibilities hasn't been identified. And so people are not only doing the same work, so 3 people are doing the exact same task in, let's say, creating our QBDs, but they're doing it in different ways. And sometimes we can contradict each other. So we want to make sure that we're determining where's the data residing, right? Who's having access to it? How is it moving through, right? And that comes down to having a clear level of responsibility and roles for creating that. Additionally, security and governance, right? When you have multiple people working on a project, do you have one person who's in charge of all of the security across the system? You need to have that one person because we often find that when it comes to, let's say, personally identifying information, 2 people could have completely different opinions on what's personally identifiable data. We've seen organizations where they will determine that somebody's address, a personal address, that is personally identifiable data. In other organizations, it's only things like social security numbers and names. You need to have consistency across the board in all those different areas. And that's why it's really important to identify typically one individual who's going to be responsible for that. Additionally, you want to utilize technology that's available to help you in that data flow, right? There are a lot of products that are out there that can help you with version control. It can help you with masking personally identifiable information and providing that information out. Qlik happens to have a product, QDC, which covers this exact issue here, right? It helps to orchestrate who gets the data, when they get the data, and what data they get. So that's an important thing to be able to make sure you have that documented at the beginning, because otherwise it becomes somewhat of a Wild West. Right? People just start with their data set or with their information. They start implementing security rules that are completely different than anybody else. Or they start doing governance that's completely different than anybody else. Right? But there's more practical elements that you need to take into consideration when you look at your data flow. So you need to document and socialize those best practices across the industry and across your implementation. Right? And this goes down to things like naming conventions, file locations, right? Documentation. Oftentimes you'll find that if you have multiple developers, if you have multiple people working on a project, they might all have different naming conventions that they ascribe to. So maybe they use all uppercase. Maybe they use all proper case. Nothing creates more time for development than by having an inconsistent data set, and inconsistent data across an organization. It makes things much easier from a development standpoint, as well as a user standpoint, if things are consistent across the board and how that you're going to identify that information. Something in terms of file locations, right? You need to be able to take a look to say, how are we getting that data out to the people who need it? Oftentimes, you may be utilizing consultants, you may be utilizing multiple people within your organization. You need to be able to make sure that your environment and the way you're warehousing the data has the capability to provide that data out to the people that you need to use it. And then documentation becomes really important in terms of making sure that it's consistent across all departments and use cases. And the consistency across all the departments, that's the key thing. I've worked in a couple of organizations, or with a couple of organizations, where we had a data dictionary that was utilized with our BI group, and then a completely different data dictionary that was used with the IT team, and then a third data dictionary that was utilized for the business. And the way that it worked is that we as developers would have to fill out that information in all three different environments. And each one had pretty much the same information, but slight differences, slight changes based on who needed that. And I can't tell you how much time was spent documenting the exact same thing over and over again. So as you're looking at the data flow, how it's moving through, make sure you're identifying one process that gives you the documentation that meets everybody's needs. So that way you're not forcing your developers to spend amazing amounts of time doing the same work over and over again. Okay. And finally, really ensure that your UAT environment has production level data. This is extremely important, especially when you have some lack of trust with the data that's in your system. Again, I've worked with organizations where the UAT data is either an abridged version of their production data, or it was a snapshot in time, right? You need to make sure that your developers are looking at the same data that the business is going to see when they move their updates, their changes, their development into the production environment. There is nothing that kills trust quicker than having the business be the first people who sees your changes or your updates. Because the second there's a problem, they're going to send that information out to you. And again, that just builds a mistrust in the data. So when you're doing this migration, you want to make sure that it's successful. So you want to make sure that you're looking at the exact same thing that the business is looking at before they do. It's the easiest way to catch any small updates, changes, right? Any issues that may derive from the fact that a new record was added into the system. Okay. Now, a proof of concept is really something that a lot of people do before they do the migration. Oftentimes, you'll see that people do an initial proof of concept between a couple of different tools. They choose their tool that they're going to utilize, and they go ahead and implement that solution without doing any other updates or any other proof of concepts along the way. And this is really an issue that I see more often, is that there are all these plans that people have, ways that the data is going to move, ways that people are going to get the data, but it doesn't take into consideration the reality of the situation, right? So I was working with an organization where we started the movement of the data from the source system to our warehouse. We started it every night at 2 a.m. And it took roughly 6 hours for that data to be loaded into the warehouse. So typically the data would be loaded by about 8 in the morning. That's when it would be available. However, in the documentation, we had indicated that all of the applications were going to be refreshed at 7 in the morning. Well, there's no way to do that. There's no way to refresh the data by 7 in the morning if our data warehouse isn't even refreshed until 8. And oftentimes you're not going to see that type of issue that comes up, or the bottlenecks, until you run through your entire process. And by running through a proof of concept at this stage, you're going to be able to identify what are those bottlenecks, right? What are those areas that you're requiring everybody to submit approval when there's a change? Well, how many people do you have that are working on those approvals, right? Is it going to take a week for approvals to happen? What are the contingencies, right? So if there's a bottleneck, if there's an issue such as what I talked about, what are the ways that you can avoid that issue? Because you want to have those types of issues resolved before they become a problem, right? So you also want to be able to start taking a look and determine the capacity of the system to handle it. I was working with an organization where we were doing weekly snapshots because we thought that would be the best way to save all the information, was doing these snapshots on a weekly basis. However, nobody actually looked at the underlying data before we made that decision. And they didn't realize that within a week, or within a couple of months, we would have billions of lines of data. And unfortunately, the data warehouse that was being stood up would be overwhelmed within 3 months. Those decisions were made in terms of our business needs without actually going through that process, looking at the data as it was run through. And so that's really where a proof of concept would have saved a lot of time and would have allowed us to rework what our expectations were based on the reality of the situation. So when doing a proof of concept at this stage, it's really important to choose a representative case, right? Go through moving one of your largest tables, right, or group of tables. If you're trying to connect multiple data sources together by tying them with certain IDs between those source systems, go ahead and run that. Do the connection. See if that's even capable. What are the issues that you're going to run into if you do so, right? The best thing to do is to find out all of these problems, these issues, again, before it gets to the business, before you fully migrate to this new environment. And then in development, oftentimes we see people hesitant to migrate to this new environment because it seems overwhelming, right? There's so much to do. Moving data sources, perhaps, rebuilding all of your applications. There can be so many daunting tasks that are involved here that many people just use that as a reason not to migrate. But the reality is, everything doesn't have to be perfect when you're doing this migration. The best way to do a migration of this size is to take it piece by piece, right? Do some small development, quick wins, get the information moved over, and you can do it over a period of time, right? You never want to make a situation where everything is moved from an existing environment to a new environment at the same time, and you just cut away from that old environment because you don't know what issues are going to pop up, what issues people may have with the new environment. So go ahead and move that over in a piecemeal fashion, right? Use the Agile approach. And that will definitely help you to take what could be a very overwhelming project and turn it into manageable pieces. So some of the things that you can do to really help in terms of that development and make sure that it is as quick and as efficient as it can be is to create a unified data ingestion layer, right? You want to make sure that there is one layer that people are utilizing to access the data from your system. And that is the best way to do that within the Qlik Sense environment is through utilizing extract and transformed QBDs, right? So you want to be able to take the data as it is in the system and extract it to a QBD layer, right? Or even a data warehouse. And they should be exactly what's in that source system. And then create transformed QBDs off of those extracted. And this really helps out to be able to allow multiple developers to be able to create applications off of these unified data sets. It also allows you to create uniformity within the QBDs. Again, that goes back to the issue of, are all the fields in uppercase? Are all of them in proper case? right? What are the best practices that we're using as an organization? All of those can be addressed by creating this unified data ingestion layer. Additionally, it's really helpful to start to create templates for your front-end applications, right? Every developer is a little bit different, and when it comes to data visualizations, there's often a little bit of art that goes into it, right? We all have our personal styles. We all bring a little bit of stylistic choices into our applications, and a lot of time can be saved by creating unified templates so that everybody is working off of the same types of visuals, the same colors, the style, the content flow. It makes it so that everybody's doing the same thing, which is going to cut down on people making stylistic choices. And it's also going to help all the users because they're going to see a unified approach to the applications, right? So if I'm a user who may interact with 5 or 10 different applications, if they all have the same look, the same feel, it's going to be much easier for me to utilize that application, and I'm going to feel more comfortable about it as a whole. Additionally, it is extremely helpful to implement a release schedule and release notes. So we see this all the time with our software, right? Even Qlik has a release schedule for when the new versions of Qlik are going to be brought out. They have that release schedule along with release notes. There's no reason not to use that same type of process when it comes to your applications. And I've implemented this at countless clients, and it really helps to provide security among the user group of that knowledge of this is when my changes are going to be implemented. This is when I can expect certain changes to be made. Without a release schedule, right? From a developer standpoint, you can start to get lost in how many updates are being made, and maybe they're being made at the behest of one department, but every other department doesn't know about it, right? By having a unified release schedule, it allows you to disseminate that to every department, every user, and it allows you to let them know what changes are being made. So I can't tell you how useful it is to have a release schedule and release notes for your applications. And if you are migrating from Qlikview to Qlik Sense, which is a really easy process, you are going to benefit greatly from utilizing the Qlikview Converter. So the Qlikview Converter is a module that's available within the Dev Hub, and it is extremely useful in getting all the elements built within the Qlik Sense environment that you've already built within Qlikview. So one of the biggest areas that it helps with is within the master library. So the master library in Qlik Sense allows you to have scalable measures, dimensions, and the Qlikview Converter will basically look at any Qlikview application, and it will look at the dimensions you're using, the expressions that you're using, and it will automatically pull those in as master dimensions and master measures. That is extremely useful because in the Qlik Sense environment, right, you simply drag and drop these master items into your visualizations. So if they're already pre-created for you, right, you don't have to recreate them. It's going to make your life that much easier, and it's going to make the development so simple. Now, one of the things, though, is it does take a little bit of pre-work and thought when you're using this converter, because the system, the Qlikview Converter system, will bring over every object, and it will look at every dimension and every expression, and it will create those as master items. And in doing so, it will create the label or the name of the dimension or expression as the name of the master item in that library. That means if you have a bar chart, let's say, in your Qlikview application, and you haven't really labeled the expression because there's not really a large need to, you've addressed it in the title, it's going to bring over that field as a new master measure, but it's going to give it the name of the calculation. So it may be equals sum sales, right? That's the name of the measure. So you want to make sure that you go through and adjust the information in your Qlikview applications so that when you utilize the converter, it brings the information over in a cleaned way so that it's much more usable, right? Additionally, it's going to bring over all of your objects. So if you have the same measure that's being used in, let's say, bar charts, pie charts, it's also in a couple of tables, right? You want to only bring that master item over once because you don't want master items to become filled with duplications. So you want to clean that initial Qlikview application so that you're only bringing in sort of representative information. And oftentimes I see people utilize tables for this because it's a very quick, clean way to bring over all of your master items, right? Because you can just limit the different fields that are being brought over. Additionally, you're making sure that you're adjusting the script. It does bring over your script for you, but because the Qlik Sense environment uses libraries as opposed to direct paths, you are going to need to make a few quick updates to that. Okay, but the Qlikview Converter really is an amazingly useful tool that will help get this migration done in a much shorter time frame. Okay. So I'm going to take a look here at the questions, and we will go through anybody's questions at this point. So let me pop out that question. Okay, so it looks like the only questions are in regards to the audio. I hope everybody was able to hear the audio, and I'm sorry for my voice breaking a little bit. I do have a sinus infection, so unfortunately I had to cough a few times there, so my apologies. But does anybody have any questions at this point? Go ahead and type them into the questions area, and we will make sure we address those. Okay, so I'm not seeing any questions, so I'll pass that back to Tracy. And again, I appreciate everybody's time, and my apologies for being a little under the weather today.
Cool, thanks. Can you guys hear me? Or Travis, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Sorry, I had to switch to my AirPods. My phone stopped working. So just wanted to close up real quick. Thanks again, Travis, for presenting, and thanks to everyone for joining. Like Travis said, we know everyone's time is really valuable, so we hope that you picked up some tips here for migrating to Sense. And if you do have any questions after this webinar, feel free to reach out. I will be sending everyone a follow-up email that does contain a link to this webinar. So if you have any questions, you can feel free to respond to that email. So that concludes our webinar. Thanks again for joining, and I hope that you all have a great day.